Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into something a little unexpected today?
Unexpected is good, right?
I think so, especially when it's about something as powerful as imagination.
Imagination. Not usually the first thing that comes to mind when we think about serious decision making.
Exactly. But that's what we're exploring today, the surprising role of imagination, especially when we're dealing with all those unknowns in life and business.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Where are we starting with this? Some super creative brainstorming session.
Actually, we're going to be unpacking a talk by an economics professor.
An economics professor
Yeah.
talking about imagination? That is unexpected.
Right. But trust me, it's fascinating. He gave this talk at the Kansas City Public Library, and he makes a really compelling case for why imagination matters, even in fields like business and economics.
All right, so what's the main takeaway here? Why should we care about imagination if we're, say, trying to make a big business decision?
Well, he starts by reminding us that uncertainty is everywhere. We can't predict the future perfectly, especially in the business world.
True enough. No crystal ball for us, unfortunately.
Right. But he goes further than that. He makes this really interesting distinction between two types of uncertainty.
Two types.
Yeah. He calls the first one one-off uncertainty, which is about a specific, unique situation, like, say, a court case or a particular business deal that has its own quirks.
Makes sense. That's uncertainty about that specific thing, not some general trend.
Exactly. Then there's what he calls distributional or statistical uncertainty. That's the kind of uncertainty we have when we're dealing with broad patterns and trends, like market data or demographics.
Okay, I see the difference. One's about a specific event, the other's about the bigger picture. But how does he actually illustrate this, in real life?
He uses this really interesting legal case. It's called the blue bus case.
Blue bus. Sounds whimsical for a legal case.
It does, right? But the case itself is pretty straightforward. A guy gets hit by a bus at night and unfortunately can't tell what company the bus was from. But he does know the blue bus company runs most of the buses in the area.
Ah, so he sues them based on the odds. If most of the buses are blue, chances are it was one of theirs that hit him.
Right, exactly. Seems logical, right?
Yeah, I can see the reasoning. But what happened?
Well, both the judge and the Supreme Court actually threw out the case.
Wow, really? Why?
They basically said that you can't just rely on statistics in these really unique individual situations. Yes, statistically, it's more likely that a blue bus hit him, but that doesn't automatically mean it was a blue bus company bus.
Interesting. So it's not enough to just go off of probability alone?
That's what the courts decided. Sometimes you need more than just the numbers to make a sound decision.
Okay, so we've got these two kinds of uncertainty, one-off and distributional. We've got a legal case highlighting why relying only on statistics can be tricky. But where does the imagination piece come in?
That's where it gets really cool. The professor argues that imagination is how we bridge the gap between what we know and what we don't know, especially in those one-off situations where statistics might not give us the full picture.
Ah, I see. So when we're dealing with something new or unexpected, we can't always just rely on past trends to predict what will happen.
Exactly. And he calls this approach groundedly imaginative discourse.
Groundedly imaginative. It's kind of an interesting mix of words, isn't it? What does he mean by that?
He's basically saying it's about combining the evidence we do have with creative thinking. So not just wild guesses, but informed possibilities. It's how can we blend facts with, a dose of smart creativity?
That makes sense. He even tells a funny story, right? About another economics professor.
Oh, yeah, the one who kind of looks down on journalists.
Yeah. The professor says this other economist thinks journalists take one fact and make a story out of it.
I guess some economists need, at least two facts to get their imaginations going.
Well, I think it highlights two different ways of seeing the world, right? Some people, maybe like that other economist, are all about the big picture, statistics, trends. But then you have others who are more drawn to the specifics of individual situations, the details, the stories that explain them. And it sounds like this professor is saying we need both.
Totally. We need the data, but we also need to be able to make sense of it, especially in those tricky one-off situations. And that's where imagination comes in.
You know what? This is making me think we're often so focused on getting hard data for everything. But maybe sometimes a well-reasoned story or a creative solution, that's actually the way to go, especially if we're dealing with something totally new.
I think you're right. This professor is definitely challenging us to think differently about the role of stories. They're not just entertainment. They're a way of understanding the world, a way to connect the dots when we don't have all the answers.
So how do we actually use this imaginative discourse? Does he give us any tools or examples?
Oh, yeah, definitely. He's a big believer in the power of language, using metaphors, similes, even just good old-fashioned storytelling to bring ideas to life.
Oh, yeah. Like when someone's pitching a business and they say it's Zooth, the Uber of, or the Amazon of something, we immediately get what they mean.
Exactly. It taps into our existing knowledge and helps us grasp something new really quickly.
It makes it seem more plausible too, right? Even though we might not have all the details yet.
He even quotes a venture capitalist who says, "People are lured by the quality of the stories."
Wow. So even investors who are supposed to be all about the numbers are swayed by a good story.
It seems so. It highlights that even in business, there's this human element, this need to connect with a vision, with a possibility of what could be.
Okay, so we need to use evocative language. We need to tell compelling stories. But are there any limits to this imaginative approach? Like, can we just let our imaginations run totally wild?
That's where it gets even more interesting. Because the professor argues that sometimes adding in made-up details can actually make an argument more persuasive.
Wait, what? Made up details. Like, isn't that, I don't know, kind of dishonest?
It sounds counterintuitive, right? But think about it, if you have a really detailed business plan or a financial projection, even if some of those numbers are based on assumptions, the very act of creating those details makes the plan seem more believable.
Okay, I can kind of see that. Like, it shows you've really thought things through and you're serious about your idea.
Exactly. That's one reason. He also says it shows you have a deep understanding of the field you're operating in, like you've done your homework.
Makes sense. What's the third reason?
This is the coolest one, I think. He says it suggests you have the ability to solve problems that might pop up in the future.
Ah, so it's not just about the plan itself, but also showing you can adapt and problem solve when things inevitably don't go perfectly.
Exactly. It's like you're saying, hey, I've thought about all the ways this could go wrong, and here's how I'd handle it. You're demonstrating a flexible mindset, which is so important when, well, the future's always uncertain.
This is making me think about those elaborate presentations you see in the business world.
Like the ones this professor used to create when he worked at McKinsey.
Yeah. He said he used to wonder why they spent so much time on them. Now he gets it. It wasn't just about conveying information. It was about conveying confidence and an ability to think on your feet.
It makes you wonder, in our quest for data-driven everything, are we sometimes missing out on the value of a good story? Especially when we're trying to tackle those really big, complex challenges.
That's a great question. And it leads perfectly into the professor's next point, the unwritten rules of communication. He compares them to, get this, literary genres.
Business presentations as literary genres. Okay, I'm definitely curious now. How does that work?
He's basically saying that just like there are certain conventions and expectations for different types of stories, like a mystery versus a romance novel,
Yeah.
there are also unwritten rules for different types of business conversations.
So how you pitch an idea to a venture capitalist
Right.
is going to be different from how you present a report to your boss.
Exactly. And these rules, these conventions, they change over time. They're influenced by things like how high the stakes are, how complex the issue is, and how the decisions might affect other people.
So the way we communicate an idea really depends on the context and the audience. Makes sense.
And to explain this idea, he uses this really cool visual, a spectrum ranging from a tiny whitewater canoe to a giant three-master schooner.
Okay, I'm picturing it. What do the canoe and the schooner represent?
So the canoe, that's your self-funded entrepreneur just starting out facing a lot of unknowns, not a lot of resources. And the schooner, that's your huge public company, tons of resources, much stricter rules and regulations.
I love that analogy. So the amount of detail, the evidence you need to bring to the table depends on where you are, that spectrum, from scrappy entrepreneur to established corporation.
You got it. And he goes on to say that companies need to change their routines, their processes as they grow and face different levels of uncertainty. What works when you're paddling that little canoe, facing the rapids, might not be effective when you're captaining a giant schooner.
I'm picturing it now. It's like as a company grows, it needs to upgrade to a bigger and bigger boat to handle the changing waters.
That's a great way to put it. But he also emphasizes that even those giant companies, even the ones that we think of as very process-driven, they still need room for creativity, for flexibility if they want to stay ahead of the curve.
So it's about finding that balance between structure and freedom, between being data-driven and being open to new ideas.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even in the most complex systems, there's still a need for that human element, that spark of imagination that can drive innovation and progress.
Well, this has certainly given me a lot to think about. It seems like this professor is urging us to reclaim the power of imagination, not just as something fun and creative, but as an essential tool for navigating uncertainty, making decisions, and even driving innovation in business and beyond.
And what's even more fascinating is how he traces this idea all the way back to ancient philosophy, which we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. Get ready for a journey through time. You know, it's amazing how this professor connects what we've been talking about, this idea of imagination, to, like, ancient philosophy.
Oh, really? I'm not sure I see the connection yet.
Well, he argues that this tendency we have, to downplay imagination and focus only on data, it actually goes all the way back to Aristotle.
Wait, Aristotle, the logic
Yes,
guy.
the one and only.
What did he have against using our imaginations?
Well, Aristotle believed that real knowledge, true knowledge, could only come from understanding these universal truths, these big overarching principles.
So he wasn't a big fan of focusing on individual, specific situations.
Not really. He thought those one-off events were too unpredictable, too messy to really be worth studying seriously. Like, they didn't reveal those eternal truths he was after.
So he was all about the big picture, the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. And, this view has had a huge impact on how we approach knowledge and decision-making, even today.
Really? Still?
Oh, yeah. The professor even quotes this philosopher of science who points out that even though Aristotle valued practical wisdom, he didn't really consider it true knowledge.
Because it wasn't based on, scientific principles.
Right. And the professor's point is that today there's even more disdain for that kind of practical, experience-based knowledge. It's all about following the science or making evidence-based decisions.
Which sounds good, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to make decisions based on evidence?
Of course, data and scientific evidence are incredibly important, but he's cautioning us against becoming too reliant on them, especially in situations that are, unique or totally unprecedented.
I can see that. Sometimes relying solely on past data might actually make us miss out on new opportunities or even potential risks.
Exactly. It's like that old saying, past performance is not indicative of future results. Just because something worked a certain way before doesn't mean it'll work the same way now, especially with how fast things change.
So how does he get this point across? Any good examples?
He tells this funny story about, get this, an inductivist turkey.
An inductivist turkey. Okay, I've got it here.
So picture this. A turkey on a farm. Every day, the farmer comes out at 9 a.m. and feeds him. So the turkey, being a logical bird, concludes that based on all the evidence, he's going to get fed at 9 a.m. every day, forever.
Makes sense from the turkey's perspective.
Right. But then what happens? Thanksgiving rolls around.
Oh, no. Poor turkey.
His reliance on past data led him to a very unfortunate conclusion.
That's a bit dark, but I get the point. So how does this turkey analogy apply to us non-turkeys out there making decisions?
Well, the professor argues that this over-reliance on data, this blind faith in it, is even more dangerous in today's world where everything's changing so rapidly. Things are getting disrupted constantly.
So we can't just assume the future will be like the past.
Exactly. We need to not only analyze those past trends, but also actively imagine different possible futures, even ones that might seem unlikely based on what we know now. We need to be prepared to adapt.
So he's saying it's not just about reacting to change, but about anticipating it.
Yeah.
And that takes imagination.
Exactly. And you know what? He even expresses some skepticism about all the hype surrounding, machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Really? I thought AI was supposed to be the answer to all our decision-making problems.
Well, he argues that even the most advanced algorithms, they're still ultimately based on historical data, right?
Which means they could still make that inductivist turkey mistake.
Bingo. They might not be able to truly see those disruptive events coming, those things that completely change the game.
So even AI has its limits. Okay, so if we can't just rely on data or algorithms, what is the solution? How do we avoid becoming inductivist turkeys in our own lives?
The professor's answer: embrace imagination. He argues that machines can't truly predict the future because they can't really imagine it in the same way that we can.
That's interesting. So it's like we humans have this unique ability to envision possibilities that go beyond just patterns in the data, which allows us to be more prepared for whatever the future throws at us.
That's a great way to put it. He's not saying to just throw data out the window. It's about finding that balance between the power of data and the power of imagination.
So a blend of logic and creativity, reason, and intuition.
Exactly. And he reminds us that this imaginative discourse, it's not about coming up with wacky, unrealistic ideas. It's about grounding our imagination in evidence and understanding, combining what we know with smart, creative thinking to fill in the gaps.
Right, and he talked about the importance of storytelling, using evocative language, metaphors, analogies to make even complex ideas more relatable.
And using those detailed narratives, even hypothetical ones, to show that we've really thought things through.
It's about showing expertise, but also adaptability. He even quotes the former governor of the Bank of England, who said that central bankers need to use imagination when they're setting monetary policy. If a central banker is advocating for imagination, you know it must be important.
That's a great point. It shows that this isn't just some fluffy concept, Imagination, when it's grounded in real understanding, can be a seriously powerful tool for making better decisions, even in those fields that we think of as super data-driven.
So how do we put all of this into practice? Does he give us any concrete advice on how to use our imagination more effectively?
He does. He offers a bunch of cautions and suggestions, basically tips for how to avoid those inductivist turkey traps.
I'm all ears. Lay 'em on us.
First and foremost, don't treat those unique situations as if they're just data points in a bigger trend. Each situation has its own nuances.
Don't get lost in the averages. Look at the individual story.
Exactly. He also warns against blindly extrapolating from the past.
Just because it worked before doesn't mean it will work now.
Right. And he encourages us to demand plausible explanations. Don't just blindly trust the experts without understanding their reasoning.
Ask questions, challenge assumptions.
He even makes a funny comment about those well-controlled experiments that win all the awards.
What about them?
Well, he points out that they're often so oversimplified and artificial that they don't really tell us much about the messy real world.
It's like comparing a golf course to a jungle.
Perfect analogy. And then he throws in this quote from Will Rogers that I love: "Never miss a good opportunity to shut up."
Haha, that's great.
It's a good reminder to stay humble, Even the smartest people don't have all the answers. Sometimes the best thing to do is just listen and learn.
He also touches on scenario planning, which I remember from business school. Basically, you create these different future worlds to prepare for different possibilities.
He seems a little puzzled that it hasn't caught on more widely, maybe because, outside of a few industries, there often isn't enough reliable data to really anchor those scenarios to.
It's hard to imagine all the ways the future could unfold, especially these days.
It really is. Oh, and he mentions a Q&A with the audience at the end. Someone asked about his ideas and C.P. Snow's concept of the two cultures, that divide between the sciences and the humanities.
Ah, the classic battle between logic and creativity.
And his answer is really interesting, because he says he's actually more interested in the divide between what Aristotle called practical wisdom and the humanities. He thinks fields like engineering, business, nursing, education, they could all benefit from embracing this more narrative-based way of thinking.
So he's not just advocating for imagination in decision-making. He's calling for a more well-rounded approach to knowledge in general.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that different fields have different strengths, different ways of knowing, and we can all learn from each other.
Well, this has definitely given me a lot to chew on. I'm seeing the power of imagination in a whole new light. But how can our listeners apply these insights to their own lives? We'll explore that in the last part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
All right, so we talked a lot about this imaginative discourse, but how do we actually use it, in our everyday lives?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
How do we take these, big ideas about philosophy and economics and turn them into something practical, something that helps us make better decisions at work, at home, just out in the world?
Well, the professor doesn't leave us hanging. He offers some really concrete advice.
Okay, good, because I'm ready to put this imagination thing to work.
He starts by encouraging us to think about those unique situations we encounter. The ones where the usual playbook might not apply.
Like that blue bus case we talked about.
Exactly. He says don't treat those situations as if they're just, data points in some bigger trend. Each one has its own little quirks, its own story.
So don't get so focused on the averages that we miss the individual details.
Right. And he also cautions against, blindly assuming that the future will be like the past.
Extrapolating from the past.
Yeah, exactly. Especially in a world where things are changing so fast. What worked before might not work now.
So we've got to be prepared to adapt, be ready for the unexpected. What else?
He also says we should demand plausible explanations. Don't just take an expert's word for it, even if they say trust the science.
Don't be afraid to ask why.
Exactly. Push back a little, make sure the reasoning makes sense to you. He's all about encouraging healthy skepticism, even when you're dealing with really complex or technical stuff.
I like that. So we're not just blindly following the data or blindly trusting authority. We're using our own judgment, our own critical thinking skills.
Right. And he has this funny little aside about those well-controlled experiments.
Oh, yeah. What about them?
He says they often win awards, but they can be so simplified, so removed from the real world, that they don't really tell us all that much about how things actually work.
Right. Real life is messy. It's not a perfectly controlled lab experiment.
Exactly. So yeah, the professor's a big fan of using your imagination, but he's also emphasizing the importance of grounding it in reality, in evidence. And he throws in this great Will Rogers quote.
I love a good Will Rogers quote. What is it?
Never miss a good opportunity to shut up.
Huh. That's perfect.
Yeah.
It's about humility, right?
Yeah.
Recognizing that we don't know everything.
Right. Sometimes the best way to learn is just to listen. Oh, and he also mentions scenario planning, which I know you're familiar with.
Yeah, from business school.
He seems a little surprised it hasn't caught on more widely. You know, that whole thing of creating different possible future worlds to help you prepare.
I guess it could be hard to imagine all the ways things could go, especially now when the future seems so unpredictable.
Right. It can feel overwhelming. He does mention that during the audience Q&A, someone asked him about C.P. Snow's idea of the two cultures.
Oh, yeah. The divide between the sciences and the humanities.
And his answer is really interesting. He says he's actually more intrigued by the divide between what Aristotle called practical wisdom and the humanities.
So less about science versus art and more about, like, practical know-how versus the more theoretical stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And he thinks all sorts of fields like engineering, business, nursing, education, they could all benefit from incorporating some of that more narrative-based thinking.
Like the kind of thinking that's more common in law or the arts.
Exactly. It's about bringing together different ways of knowing, different perspectives, and using them all to make better decisions, solve tougher problems.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about. It's like a whole new way of looking at imagination.
And how it can actually be a powerful tool for navigating uncertainty and shaping our own futures.
So here's a final thought for all of you listening out there. Think back to a recent decision you made. It could be anything, big or small. Did imagination play a role? Maybe you consciously used it to brainstorm different options, or maybe it was working more behind the scenes, influencing your intuition. And here's the key question. Could understanding this process, this interplay of data, experience, and imagination, help you make better decisions moving forward?
I think so, and I think this professor would agree. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.